Our landscape is littered with abandoned spaces, sad monuments to a time long forgotten. While most people are oblivious to their existence, there are those who see them as portals to the past. They go in looking for answers and share what they find online. Not your everyday urban explorer, but seekers of truth, trying to uncover a history abandoned. We dug into the secretive online world of the urban explorer and found a lot of chatter on social media. We found many that mentioned 3 hotspots in New York. Vocativ decided to investigate. First stop, Kings Park Mental Hospital.
We just squeezed through this tiny little opening, had to jump down through a grate to get in here. And one of the first rooms we've come to is this craft room. You can see the walls are covered with murals that were most likely done by a patient. All over the floor you see these craft projects kind of still in progress, you know, half-finished rugs and weavings, looms. So we're about to make our way up from the kind of basement floor, heading up the stairs, and now we're coming to the living area where residents would sleep and spend most of their time. And then these kind of mass living areas, which are just split up by little cubicles where you'd have tons of beds stuffed inside. They even were having to fit beds in the hallway. At its peak, Kings Park had over 9,000 residents living there, which is well over its capacity. It was founded, you know, in the late 1800s. At that point, it was kind of a facility to house the mentally ill coming from Brooklyn, from Kings County. As the population really started to expand very quickly in the city and across the United States, they built more and more buildings to house this influx of psychotic and mentally ill patients. It also became a self-sustaining community that would raise its own food and livestock. Places like this had their own power plant, their own firehouse, their own hospitals. There was no reason these patients ever had to leave once they were checked in. One of the things that makes Kings Park kind of notable is it was one of the first institutions to use lobotomy and electroshock therapy, and they used it really extensively here. You hear lobotomy and shock therapy now, and you know, it immediately conjures these images of horrific, traumatic treatments, and they were at the time. We look back at the lobotomy as a really grisly, grotesque procedure, but at the time it was really celebrated and lauded as this huge development in the treatment of mental illness. And in fact, the first doctors who discovered this treatment were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for medicine. So we might look at the history of Kings Park and this kind of excessive use of lobotomies and shock therapy and think of it as kind of this really sinister, dark place. But really, the entire time, Kings Park was on the cutting edge of psychological treatment, of the treatment of mental illness. In the 1960s, when they started developing these antipsychotic drugs, Kings Park was still on the cutting edge of that research and was one of the first institutions to implement the use of antipsychotic medication. We're here in the town of Teals in upstate New York, about an hour from Manhattan, at a place called Letchworth Village. and this was an institution for the developmentally disabled, opened up in 1911 and went on until the mid-90s, and it closed down. So we're going to cut through here now. This is the hospital you can kind of see in the distance over here. This is one of the largest buildings in Letchworth Village and reputedly the most haunted, so we'll see. The room we're going to see first, we're going to walk through, is one of my favorites in the whole building. It's kind of a library where they kept a lot of kind of technical manuals or books about medical care. It's actually some kind of arson attempt there recently, so you see all these piles of burned books. So right now we're standing in the hospital laboratory, which is supposedly the most haunted room in the hospital. And that goes back to this history of experimentation that took place at Letchworth Village, which was actually always part of their mission statement. They thought that using these residents and oftentimes children as test subjects was kind of a way for them to give back to society and contribute to the progress of medicine. Letchworth Village was the site of one of the first experimental trials of the polio vaccine. So you could argue that some good did come out of that. But of course, these kids aren't able to give or deny consent. You know, they were just kind of used as these test subjects, kind of against their will. These looks like they were refrigerated, like cold storage. When the residents died here, they would be taken to the lab and had their brains actually removed and stored in these jars of formaldehyde, which were maybe stored in some of these cabinets here, put on display. And again, the rationale for that was that they're preserving this anatomy to study their conditions and, you know, improve treatment in the future. But obviously that's just a horrific and really sinister part of the history here. So that's why you hear all these ghost stories about this haunting that is supposedly taking place here. Today we are checking out the farm colony in Staten Island. Sometimes you hear Staten Island called the Forgotten Borough. We're in what is probably the most forgotten corner of the Forgotten Borough. So we just pulled up to the farm colony, found a big old hole in the fence, had to go through a little nature trail to get here. The farm colony is composed of about a dozen pretty large structures that were a part of an institution, and it was founded around the first half of the 1800s. The idea behind the farm colony was to have a place where the poorest citizens of New York could come and live, to sort of segregate them from society and to give them access to health care, give them a roof over their head. And the idea was that they would work the land in exchange for that. We're about to head into one of these later dormitories. These were built around the 1930s. So I think we'll head into the basement first. This is where I take people when I want to really creep them out, because it's just totally pitch black. This place, you hear a lot of rumors about it, but there's really not much truth to a lot of those rumors. And a lot of that comes from the fact that nearby in the same area you had Willowbrook State School that actually has a real place in the history of, you know, the treatment of the developmentally disabled. And in the 1970s you had Geraldo Rivera coming in and doing this expose on the conditions there that were really truly horrific. Later the institution was closed down. Willowbrook State School, when it was abandoned, was connected to this series of child murders that took place in the 70s and 80s in Staten Island. The man who is thought responsible for those murders, which usually involved disabled kids, is Andre Rand, who was a former orderly at Willowbrook. And once it was shut down, he stayed on and kept living in the abandoned hospital, supposedly in the tunnels underground. And in fact, one of the bodies of the victims was found buried in a shallow grave not far from his campsite in the abandoned Willowbrook State Hospital. And it's so nearby that all of that kind of mythology and those stories have transferred over to the farm colony. But you can definitely see that it's really ripe for those kinds of urban legends because it is undeniably creepy. And that's what brings so many people here. And this building in particular has this beautiful staircase. This was another dormitory. The stairwells tend to last longer, but if you come out a little further, you see there's really nothing left of the building, but it's totally just given over to nature in this really beautiful way. But here you can see all these old beds. You can see how long this thing has been here. There's a sapling growing out of it. It's pretty magical right now, this condition it's in. You know, you almost feel like you're discovering some ancient civilization. And it's crazy to think that all this happened in like 40 years. I think the kind of history we learn in school is kind of sugar-coated in a way. This is a really kind of shameful thing for all of us, and we all kind of share this collective guilt about this pretty regrettable period of our history. But what ended up happening is all of these facilities, you know, across the country really became horribly overpopulated, understaffed, underfunded. You know, it's hard to find out who do we really blame for that.